Thank you, Mary, and good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the audience, and I hope over the next 45 minutes or so that I can give you just a surface-level introduction to what I cover in a semester-long course at the University of Idaho in a class called Mass Media and Public Opinion that is a mix of media and politics. I get PR students, journalism students, and public relations and political science students who are all interested in the theory, the application, and the interpretation of public opinion. When Lauren Finns first invited me to give this presentation, she wanted to call it the science of opinion polling. But I'm not a social scientist. I'm a historian and a journalist and an educator, and I have modified the title to reflect that there is as much art as there is science and statistics in public opinion polling, because it's important for people who conduct polls as well as those who report on them to provide historical context, to provide a little interpretation and analysis and shading to help make sense of the results, and especially not to oversell the meaning of a public opinion poll, which in many cases is just a snapshot of public opinion and not a prediction. So I have a couple of historical examples to show you. This is 1948, and some of you may have been alive at the time of that election, but others may have seen this famous headline from what Harry Truman called the worst newspaper in the country, the Chicago Tribune, and he also called the Spokesman Review the second worst newspaper. So that was an early edition of the Chicago Tribune, based in part on some early election returns, along with some pre-election polling. And editorial cartoonists used that photograph in 2016, a Dewey defeats Truman lesson, media defeats Trump. This was a conservative political cartoonist, Michael Ramirez, who draws for Investors Business Daily. So one of the things we will talk about is what happened in 2016, and were the polls wrong, or were the interpretations of the polls wrong? Here's what I would like to do, just in terms of getting you a semester's worth of material in a fairly concise presentation. I'll talk a little bit about the history of opinion polling, including good and bad examples from the 20th century. Talk a little bit about survey methodology, particularly the selection of samples and the need to have a representative sample that reflects the larger population. We'll look at 2016 and also what happened in 2018 in the midterm elections. And I will try to end on a somewhat optimistic note to talk about a new method for measuring public opinion that has a great deal of promise for things that go beyond just the election results, and perhaps more suited for better understanding why people feel the way that they feel. And then I want to leave lots of time for questions and answers. In the history of polling, public opinion polling, I want to look at three key elections. The 1936 election with Franklin Roosevelt and Alf Landon. 48, as I mentioned earlier, Truman versus Dewey, and then the most recent presidential election with Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. Let's start with 1936, and the candidates were Franklin Roosevelt
running for his second term, and Alf Landon, who had been the governor of Kansas. And it was the beginning of modern political polling because there was a magazine known as the Literary Digest, which was founded in the early 20th century and was sort of had set itself up as a leader in the measurement of public opinion and the coverage of politics and culture. That's actually Charles Lindbergh was on the cover of the issue in 1936 that included the pre-election polling. And then the man on the right is George Gallup, who was then a journalism professor at Drake University in Iowa. And we now know him, of course.
What university?
Drake. He lent his name to the Gallup poll, and for most of the next 50 years was associated with that. And now George Gallup Jr. is the president of the Gallup Research Firm. So the Literary Digest predicted Alf Landon would cruise to victory in a landslide, while George Gallup predicted that FDR would win a second term. So which of those two were right? Well, we never had a President Landon, so we have to assume that Roosevelt did win. He carried 46 states and got 523 electoral votes. Landon carried 2 states, Maine and Vermont. The people that study public opinion polling now have gone back and tried to analyze what happened that year. What were the differences in how Gallup and the magazine had tried to accurately forecast the election results based on the mood of the voters that year. The Literary Digest relied on telephone directories as a source of people who would be interviewed, auto records on licensing and registration, and then they mailed questionnaires to 10 million subscribers. That was quite a large circulation magazine. And so think about those 3 groups in 1936. What would have been the demographic characteristics of
Money.
people who had money for cars, for telephones, when not every household had a car or a telephone, or people who could subscribe to a magazine? So fair to say that the sample of the American population that the Literary Digest contacted and asked to respond was, on the whole, wealthier, better educated, probably more urban than the American electorate as a whole. Meanwhile, George Gallup introduced a radical new concept of random sampling. So rather than trying to just invite people to self-select, the Gallup organization contacted people, and for what was used from the 30s until the 80s, Gallup did primarily face-to-face interviews rather than on telephone, because they wanted to reach people who didn't necessarily have telephones. And they tried to match their sample to the characteristics of the American electorate as a whole, using something called quotas. We would also call it stratifying the sample by age and income and geographic location. Probably not much stratification at that period to reflect racial and ethnic differences, but there was a sincere attempt to match the demographics of the population. And Gallup ended up doing about 10,000 questionnaires, so a fairly large sample by today's standards, but nowhere near the millions of people that the Literary Digest used. And so it was not the kind of self-selected survey, but that the random nature meant that it was going to be possible to have a pretty good snapshot of the electorate without having to do tens of thousands of interviews. In subsequent elections in 1940 and 44, Gallup's polls were accurate. Of course, Roosevelt won comfortably in 1940 and 44. But in 1948, Gallup was wrong. He and a lot of pollsters and a lot of news organizations just assumed that Harry Truman was going to not win a full term. He had succeeded Roosevelt as president in 1945 and had served 3 years. But as this grinning Truman headline indicates, the pollsters and the newspapers were wrong, and Harry Truman was elected to a full term, and that was the end of Thomas Dewey's national political aspirations. Well, why was Gallup wrong that year? Well, there's some good lessons from the post-mortem on that election, and I think some lessons that are still applicable today. So Gallup continued to draw quotas. He tried to get a representative sample of the national population, but what he was using was the 1940 census, which at that point was more than 8 years old, and there have been significant demographic changes in the country in the 1940s, particularly as a result of World War II, increased urbanization, the migration of African Americans from the South to cities in the North and the Midwest. And the pollsters were so confident in their results that by mid-October they thought things were wrapped up. So in the process of choosing when to do their surveying and to tally it up, they failed to take into account the factor of late deciders, people who came to a decision, and maybe they were undecided or they changed their mind in the couple weeks between mid-November and the election. So some factors there. And there were changes in the party structure at that time. And there were 2 splinter groups from the Democrats. The Progressive Party, led by Henry Wallace, who had been Roosevelt's vice president, actually, from 40 to 44. And the Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, which was a segregationist party very much opposed to Roosevelt's and Truman's attempts to do things like integrate the armed services. And in 1948, those newly enfranchised blacks in the North and the Midwest voted overwhelmingly for Truman, but they were unlikely to have been counted in some of the pre-election surveys. And you're seeing the electoral map from 1948, blue for the Democrats under Truman, red for the Republicans, and then that sort of yellow gold in the South for Strom Thurmond for the Dixiecrats.